Good afternoon. I'm Steve McConey from Brandywine Oak Private Wealth. I'd like to welcome everybody watching this presentation via Zoom and also listening via teleconference. And I want to thank members of the team who have put the technology for this event together. As part of the panel, we're having Michael Henley and Allison Brooks from our team who will be asking questions that we have gotten from our clients. I'm finding that there's been a huge response from clients to this event because of the pending and imminent presidential election. There's a lot of concern about how this might play out, the impact that it might have on the markets and retirees. If you think about it, a year ago, there was no such thing as coronavirus. The economy was humming along, stock market was doing well, unemployment was low, and a lot of that has changed. So what we've done is put a presentation together that's going to feature Jeff Bush from the Washington Update, who's going to address numerous topics. He's going to cover the pandemic response and talk about the budget deficit and what he sees regarding that. He's going to talk about the platforms of the two candidates. He's going to talk about potential outcomes. And we're going to talk a little bit about some strategies, as we all know that some of the recent tax laws, including the Secure Act, has changed some of the provisions of retirement accounts. We want to make sure we address that. Jeff Bush from the Washington Update, he's the primary collaborator with Andy Friedman. We've hosted, Jeff many, many times. And the thing I can best say is every single time that we have hosted him, I know I have learned a lot of things that I didn't know. He's able to connect the dots on some very, very complex topics. Clients have been very responsive. So without further ado, I want to introduce Jeff Bush.
Well, thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. And it's great to be back in front of you here again today. And when I was thinking about addressing this audience specifically, I said, I really ought to start with a metaphor or a picture, if you will, for how DC has felt over the last 10 months. And it wasn't until I came across this picture of this road sign that I thought, that's perfect. That's exactly how it's felt in Washington, DC. We thought we had a plan for 2020. We got it sideways, we got it turned around, we got sideswiped by a few tweets every now and then. It's just been a crazy 10-month period. But it really is that craziness that gives us an opportunity to have a very robust discussion today around that pandemic legislative relief laid across the backdrop of the 2020 election. But then most importantly, what does that mean to you and I as investors? So I'm just going to jump right in. Now, conventional wisdom is that nothing happens in DC during an election year. And while that's normally true, who knew if you wanted to spend $2.8 trillion, guess what? You could get a lot of big things done. And that's what we've seen happen with the pandemic legislative relief thus far. And if you remember, it started with that little $8 billion round one bill. Notice it doesn't even show up on the graph on the right. It wasn't until round two that we started to get into more significant dollars at $150 billion. That's what pushed tax day to July 15th, as well as expanded the Family Medical Leave Act and paid sick leave to firms under 500 employees. But you're probably most familiar with the CARES Act. That was the round three, $2.2 trillion bill. It funded the $600 a week unemployment program, the Paycheck Protection Loan program, as well as that $1,200 check that most Americans received earlier this year. But you might remember we ran out of Paycheck Protection Loan money within 3 weeks or so. And the Republicans wanted to refund that with a simple clean bill of $310 billion. Democrats agreed it needed to be refunded, but they said, you're not going to get our votes for free. What they wanted was an allocation of that $310 billion, specifically $60 billion, to go to community banks and credit unions because they tend to serve underserved communities. Beyond that, they also wanted money for testing in hospitals and other priorities, and that's what drove the cost of that bill up to $484 billion. But that's how we ended up at $2.8 trillion being already spent towards the pandemic thus far. And as you know, that $2.8 trillion is a somewhat esoteric number. It really is hard for us to get a head around just how big that number actually is. So I give you a comparable. If you think of every single tax dollar that went to the federal government in fiscal year 2019, that only totaled $3.46 trillion. So 3.46 trillion in total revenues for the entire year to the federal government, compared to 2.8 trillion ostensibly being spent over 8 to 12 weeks. Now, you know we're not done at this point. We're already talking about round 4. And while those negotiations have been on again, off again, on again, off again, more times than we can count, we do know at least what the debate playing field looks like. And for the Democrats, it starts with aid to states and municipalities. We know states have been doubly hit hard. Their revenues are down while their expenses have gone up. And Democrats originally wanted to give states up to $1 trillion. Republicans said there's no way we're going to give states $1 trillion. We're not responsible for bailing out states who had mismanaged their pension funds for so many years. Republicans are more thinking along the lines of giving them flexibility with the $150 billion they've already allocated, and then maybe sweetening that pot with another $150 billion. We also know that the pandemic was not a 12-week and we're all back to the ballgame type of scenario. And now that schools have opened, they're opening in all different formats. But no matter how they open, it's more expensive. You may not know the federal government only funds a small portion of that K through 12 budget. It's mainly a state expense. With states under so much pressure, the federal government wants to add to that budget, that contribution from the federal level for K through 12 education. Democrats are thinking a little over $200 billion, where the Republicans are more in line with a $100 billion figure. We also know the Postal Service is experiencing a challenge this year with the big uptick in mail-in ballots. It's like the Postal Service is going to have 2 Christmas seasons back to back, and they'll need more money for overtime and staffing and the like. Now, there actually are some areas of bipartisan agreement, and the first area of that agreement is around the Paycheck Protection loans. There is agreement, we need a round 2, but it will be different than the round 1 program. It will focus on smaller employers and have more controls on that money. We probably all heard those stories about those companies getting the Paycheck Protection Loan Program, which really weren't in the spirit of the law. So by tightening those controls, hopefully that more money, a higher percentage of that money, will get to the businesses that actually need it. The other area of bipartisan support is about expanding that employment tax credit. Right now, that tax credit is 50% of wages up to $45,000 a year. Some are talking about expanding it to as high as 100% of wages, maybe all the way up to $90,000 in earnings. Now, the reason that has bipartisan support is that tax credit program is keeping people on the payrolls rather than them ending up on the unemployment ranks. Now, we talked about the Democrats' priority, but the Republicans' priority is around employer liability protection. And this is a very broad definition of employer. It would include schools and churches and really any institution you can think of. They earnestly believe that if we're ever going to get this economy started again, those institutions need to feel confident to bring their employees back into the workspace and invite clients onto their premises. Well, without the risk of a class action liability. Now, that does assume they would be following CDC guidelines. But Democrats aren't so worried about employer liability protection. They're more focused on worker protection. To the extent that the president and the Democrats get what they want out of this bill, which is a bigger bill, even though President Trump pulled away from that, he has committed to it after the election, then it's likely we'll see a combination of those 2 things. Now, we also know that additional payments to individuals is also in scope, and what we're really talking about there is extending the unemployment program. That $600 a week program I mentioned earlier with the CARES Act, that ended back at the end of July. President Trump signed an executive order which bought another 5 weeks or so. So we're now 2 to almost 3 weeks into the fact that those unemployed individuals are living on state unemployment insurance only. And we know those dollar amounts can be very meager. So with that as a background, we also know that there's probably this gap that exists between this end of the executive order and when we get a round 4 deal done. So it's likely we'll see more $1,200 types of checks going out to a lot of Americans. Now, there are also some tax changes being discussed. For example, one of the more creative ideas is to have the corporate rate to 10.5% for any corporation that repatriates jobs or revenue streams back to the United States. One thing we've learned through this pandemic is we are way too dependent on other countries, specifically China, for strategically important goods. And what I'm talking about here is not only gowns and masks and things like that, but primarily pharmaceutical production. So can the tax code incent that activity so that we don't have those supply constraints at some point in the future? There were 2 tax issues that Republicans were discussing. For example, lowering capital gains tax rates and extending the 2022 deadline for the 100% for capital expenditures. I don't think either one of those will make it into the final bill, and here's why. You really can't draw a straight line from a lower capital gains tax rate to jobs. And I don't know about you, but 2022 seems like a long way down the road. There's plenty of time to address that later on, if that should be needed. Now, the president was very focused on 100% tax deduction for meals and entertainment. As you know, those industries have been decimated through the pandemic. And right now, we can only deduct 50% of meals and 0% of entertainment. So again, once it's safe to open these institutions, can we use the tax code to help rebuild those industries broadly across our economy? Some are even talking about getting rid of that $10,000 cap on state and local tax deductions. I'm sure that's music to a lot of your ears here on the East Coast. But the real area that I'm interested in is the required minimum distribution relief. I know many retirees have really appreciated that relief this year, and there was some talk about extending that into 2021. Sadly, I do not see the impetus for that today, and let me explain why. As you know, your RMD was based on the 12/31/2019 values, which were quite high, and then the market adjusted. And when the market adjusted, retirees were going to have to take those larger RMDs out of a diminished IRA balance, a recipe for disaster for long-term retirement security. Well, obviously the markets came back very nicely, so I just don't see the impetus for that for 2021 at this time. Not that that couldn't change, but right now I just don't see the impetus for that action. Now, obviously, all of this stimulus has a big impact to the fiscal situation in our country. And President Trump said back in 2019, who the heck cares about the federal budget? Well, he used a little more colorful language than that, but I won't do that today. Well, I think if you ask the president today, he'd certainly say the budget does matter, and certainly the Republicans are voicing that very same concern. But what we do know about the pandemic legislative relief so far is that we were right on track with our annual budget deficit until the pandemic hit. And then we saw that big drop off in the budget deficit and pretty much going through the basement. And we've had other experience where we've added this immediate stimulus into our economy. As a matter of fact, that financial bailout in 2008 was a good example of that. That financial bailout was $870 billion, which of course pales in comparison to the $2.8 trillion we've already allocated. But understand that $870 billion fundamentally reset the debt to GDP relationship in the United States. But notice the $2.8 trillion is not having nearly the same effect. That's a result of the low interest rate environment we're in right now. So certainly that's helping us in this context, but it really doesn't change the long-term trajectory. When you look at these updated CBO numbers, it's showing us that by 2050, the publicly held debt to GDP ratio will reach a staggering 196% of GDP. Now, just for perspective, before the pandemic, it was 146% in 2050. So a 25% increase in that just due to the pandemic legislative relief. Maybe even more interesting is notice about World War II, where we barely eclipsed 100% of debt to GDP when we enticed the entire country and bolstered the entire country fighting fascism around the entire world. But that debt was quickly paid off, really for two reasons: economic growth coming out of the war, but then also we paid off the war bonds. I'm just here to tell you right now, there is zero plan by either party to actually pay down that debt. That's just kind of where we are. And it really is a result of that growing budget deficit. And the annual budget deficit in the United States is made up of two things. Primary deficit, which is here in this magenta type of color, that is actually just overspending. It just means we budget more money than we bring in revenues. But the turquoise color, that's the actual cost of the interest only on our federal debt. And you can see, because we've added this tremendous amount of debt since 2008, that that's becoming the primary driver of that annual budget deficit. Guaranteed that we're going to have over $1 trillion deficit from now on. And the real challenge is not necessarily in the revenue, although the revenue is projected to be flat as around 18% of GDP between now and 2050. The challenge is that spending line. What's driving that again is the interest on our debt and to some degree the growing cost in Medicare. Well, this one slide tells me everything I need to know about where tax policy is likely to go over the next, say, 15 years or so. It's inevitable that revenues to the federal government are going to have to go up. Now, I don't know how they'll go up, but I do believe they'll have to go up in order to deal with that disparity between revenues and spending. We need to remember that we live in historically low tax times in 2020. Now, I do want to switch because we are talking about an academic economic theory that you may not be familiar with, and it's called modern monetary theory, or MMT for short. If you aren't familiar with it, it simply says that if you're a sovereign country and you have the ability to print your own currency, you never have to worry about debt. You never have to worry about debt because you own the printing press. Just start them up and print more currency to pay whatever interest you owe. And I'm here to tell you with 100% certainty that absolutely, positively, MMT will work until the day it doesn't. And the problem is you never know when that day will be, but we do know what that day will look like. It's when buyers of US debt say, United States, I love you, but you're not really managing your balance sheet very effectively. If you want me to share in that risk, I need a little extra yield in my bonds in order to compensate me for that additional risk. If you think I'm being hyperbolic, it was January 2019 where we had a little microcosm of this experience. The United States went to auction to sell our debt and no one would buy it. No one would buy it until we increased the yields 25 basis points across the durations. And I think that's just a microcosm of what we may be facing down the road. Now, the good news, if you want to look at it this way, is the pandemic is hitting every country. So every country is adding debt to their balance sheet at this point. And this whole relationship between debt to GDP and interest rates really is a relative measure against those other developed economies. So no one knows how we're going to look on a relative basis until well after the pandemic. Now, before we transition into the candidate platforms and the election itself, let's see what questions we have.
Thanks, Jeff, and thank you for joining us here today. We've had some clients try and compare the coronavirus to the Spanish flu of 1918. While this was 100 years ago, afterwards the market rallied for years, but then was followed by the Great Depression. Do you feel as though this comparison is fair? And if not, what do you see as the main differences between the two pandemics?
Well, I don't think it's completely fair. And the reason why is, one, our medical treatment, our medical opportunities we have today are so vastly different than we had back then. When you look at the number of people that passed away in the Spanish flu and during that time frame compared to the world population, we're not even close to that at this point. And that's because of that medical intervention. But in addition to that, what led us into that Depression era was a very inactive and actually anemic federal government. Well, clearly that's not the case here, with the Fed saying they'll do anything and everything they have to do to keep this economy going. So I just think we're well ahead of the curve in dealing with that and hedging off that kind of disaster type of scenario.
A question we get a lot, Jeff, around the deficit, especially from like Wall Street strategists, is basically that the deficit's been talked about for decades, but essentially we can keep printing money. When will there ever be a forcing event where we're going to have to do something about this?
Yeah, well, I really do think it'll come back to that buyer of U.S. debt. A lot of people assume that means China. Keep in mind, China only owes about 12% of our debt. They're not the biggest buyer. The biggest buyer of U.S. debt are you and I as individuals, our insurance companies, our pension companies. So I just don't see the impetus for that right now. When we will have to deal with this is when those buyers say, I need more yield, and then the math becomes untenable. You can't service that much debt when interest rates get to quote unquote normal rates. So it will force upon us realistically. There's no upward pressure on interest rates now, and I don't see that for some time because this is a global issue. But there will be a day when that happens. And it may be 10 years from now, it may be 5 years from now, but at some point that forcing event will be based on the buyers.
Makes sense. And with your policy hat on, if you were trying to address the national debt, how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, that is becoming a real issue. I mean, there are only so many ways to deal with it. You can inflate your way out of it, you can grow your way out of it, and then you can just ignore it, right? And that's kind of the modus operandi we're on right now. Bottom line, we need economic growth. We need that inflation to pay that down. And then, I think those things will come with time, but we're quite a ways off from that at this point.
Let's go ahead and turn it over to what everyone's waiting to hear about, the election.
Okay, so let's just kind of jump right in and talk about the candidates' platforms. As we get the technology here squared away, there we go. Oh, there we go, must hit the wrong button. There we go, candidate profiles. Bottom line, we know the two parties have assessed who their candidates are at this point is Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And I think you would agree with me that Donald Trump is a polarizing figure, but you would also have to agree that Joe Biden's not really leading a Democratic movement. And I think that's what makes 2020 such a fascinating race to dig into. And let's be honest, we haven't really heard a lot from the candidates about their platform. We certainly didn't hear anything about the platforms back on the debate last Tuesday. So what I would like to do is spend a little bit of time on both the Republican platform as well as Joe Biden's platform to kind of remind you of what those things are before we talk about the general election. What we know for the Republicans is they chose not to pass a formal platform in their August convention, and that's not unusual in a second-term run for the presidency. But they did promise us more of the same, more of that America First type of mentality that Donald Trump believes has been very successful during his first 3.5 years. And if we didn't have the pandemic, I think he'd have a fabulous argument to justify that position. But beyond that, we also know what that means tactically is he wants to continue to focus on lower taxes, meaning making those temporary tax code changes in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent. But you and I both know when we hear the term tax code and permanent in the same sentence, it's a bit of an oxymoron. The only thing permanent about the US tax code is that it will permanently change. So we need to keep that in mind as well. We know that Donald Trump would continue down this road of building up domestic energy supplies, leaning towards the traditional source of energy, fossil fuels and the like. But Donald Trump learned a very important lesson during his first term. And I honestly think no president really learns that until they're sitting behind that desk. And what I mean by that is he learned he could leverage the US economy using tariffs as a blunt instrument for not only trade wins, but also foreign policy wins. Now, if I put myself in the head of Donald Trump in a second term, I don't have to worry about being reelected. And I don't think I'm overly concerned whether Mike Pence wins in 2024 or not. So I would anticipate a second term Donald Trump president would be very active in this particular space, really doubling down on the initiatives he put into place in the first term and even going beyond. And the reason why is this is one of those very few areas our president has almost unilateral authority. He doesn't need the legislature. He can act upon his own interest or own focus. And so I think we'll see a very active president there. What we also know is that he'll continue down this road of deregulating broadly across our economy. He believes that's been a big reason we had such nice economic growth and wage growth and job growth during his first 3 years. And so why wouldn't he repeat that moving forward? I think the more interesting question, though, is would a second term Donald Trump president actually pursue an infrastructure deal with the Democrats? And let me explain why. We've been saying since the midterm election in 2018 that the fiscal conservatives, both Democrat and Republican, they lost a lot of power in that House election. And having lost that power, it opened up a new potential dialogue around funding infrastructure in our country called deficit financed infrastructure investment. In other words, we just borrow more money and build whatever we want to build. If we know anything about Donald Trump, we know he likes to build things, we know he likes to make deals, and at the same time, he likes to put his name on those projects. So I think I could see a Donald Trump in that second term making a deficit financed infrastructure deal with the Democrats in the House, and then the Republican Senate, if it is a Republican Senate, would be forced to go along with the president. And I know what you're thinking. You're saying, well, why would a Republican president do that? I think if a Republican president would do that because he would be couched under the political umbrella of a jobs program or an economic recovery program coming out of the pandemic. I remind you, it was then President or presumptive nominee Donald Trump in 2016 that said, I'm the king of debt. I love debt. I've made a lot of money with debt. So I think if that plan started to come together early in a second term of a Donald Trump presidency with a Democratic House of Representatives, we can actually see that get done next year. Now, while the Republicans haven't given us a lot of meat on this bone of a platform because they don't really need to, they have a track record they're running from, Joe Biden, on the other hand, has been very prolific, and it starts with healthcare. He agreed that Medicare eligibility should be lowered to age 60, and that was a nod to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. It really was a signal to those Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren supporters that Joe Biden's the kind of Democrat they could support. The biggest risk to Joe Biden in the 2020 election is that progressive wing of the Democratic Party felt disenfranchised or not listened to, not valued, and they simply choose not to show up and vote, not dissimilar to what happened to Hillary Clinton. So as we go through Joe Biden's platform, you'll see several of these nods to that more progressive portion of the Democratic Party. But more broadly on the healthcare front, the bigger change he'd make is he'd install a federal option within the Affordable Care Act exchanges. That federal option would compete side by side with private insurance offerings, but it would be a little bit different. You probably know that under the Affordable Care Act, there are still 30 million people in this country who lack health insurance coverage. He would auto-enroll those 30 million people in that Medicare-like option day one, guaranteeing that program's actuarial stability. But he would also double down on those reimbursement, those premium support payments as well, in two ways. He would lower the percentage of family income that could be allocated to health insurance premium down from that roughly 9.6% of income to 8.5%. And those premium subsidies would be based on the gold plan, not the silver plan, the way the law is written today. The combination of those two things would increase those premium subsidies dramatically. And remember, those are paid for by that 3.8% tax that we're all familiar with. Now, I did a little back of the napkin math. If you auto-enroll 30 million people in those plans day one, and you increase premium subsidies or paid to the majority of American families, guess what? 3.8% won't be nearly enough revenue to cover that cost. So Joe Biden's going to have to reconcile that in his health plan or his tax plan in order to make those numbers work out. We also know he wants to address prescription drugs, allowing Medicare to negotiate for drug prices, and that's one of those ironies of U.S. politics. I think you'd agree that Joe Biden takes a lot of credit for helping pass the Affordable Care Act, and rightly so. But it's the Affordable Care Act itself that prohibits Medicare to negotiate for drug prices. So a little bit of a turn of history there. But he would also allow more importation of drugs, accelerate generics into the system, and tie price increases to inflation. He would also crack down on big pharma. The big pharma uses techniques like tweaking their formulas ever so slightly to extend their patent periods. He wouldn't let them do that. He would also no longer allow them to deduct the cost of advertising. If you watch any TV or read any magazines, maybe that's not a bad idea. I think we all have seen enough pharmaceutical ads in our lifetime. But beyond that, I also want to point out that Donald Trump addressed this issue in an executive order in July of this year. He was very frustrated. He ran on this issue and he got no legislative traction early in his presidency, so he took it upon himself through executive order to address this issue as well. His executive order would allow more importation of drugs, specifically insulin, and he would also establish an international index for pricing and guarantee the United States pays most favored nation pricing. Now, this was a very narrow executive order. It only applied to drugs that are actually administered inside the doctor's office, not what you pick up at your pharmacy every month, until a month ago. 1 month ago, he expanded this order, so it would also include those pharmacy drugs that you pick up each month. Now, don't expect you're going to get a discount at your pharmacy next month. These things take several months to actually get implemented and so forth as regulations are written. But I bring it up for one other reason. I think this is one, and it may be the only one, executive order that a Joe Biden, if he is elected, may very well keep in place, this executive order. Now, beyond that, we also know that Joe Biden's proposed a $775 billion universal pre-care, child care, and elder care program. We know millions of American families struggle with those costs, and these programs would be there to help them. On the Social Security front, he wants to end means testing, although he didn't define what that means. The only thing I can think of is that earned income offset. As you know, if you're on Social Security, but you still earn a W-2 wage, your Social Security payment is reduced. I'm assuming he wants to get rid of that reduction. He would also, after 20 years, just give everyone a raise once they've been on Social Security for that period of time. And he would also reestablish a minimum benefit of 125% of the federal poverty level. That percentage had dropped precipitously over the last couple of decades because cost of living increases have been so small. On the retirement front, he had set up a federally sponsored 401k offering. And I want to be very clear. This is not the federal employee retirement plan. This is just a 401k, and the federal government happens to be the plan sponsor. So what is that program for? Well, there are 40 million Americans that go to work every day, and they don't have access to a retirement plan at work. If they don't have access to a plan at work, they can enroll in this federal 401k. That gives them a higher opportunity to save for their own retirement. He would also increase the minimum wage at the federal level to $15 an hour. And he'd make college more affordable in several ways. He'd do 2 years of community college debt-free. State and certain private colleges would be tuition-free for families earning less than $125,000. And that's all well and good if you have little ones at home, but what happens if you already have student loans? Well, he has a forgiveness program as well. This was another nod to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. That forgiveness program is based on income. If you make less than $25,000 a year, you don't pay anything. If you earn more than $25,000 a year, your payment would be no more than 5% of your monthly discretionary income. And assuming you make that payment on time, whatever balance is left at the end of 20 years would just be forgiven. If you're a public service employee, there's even a more aggressive forgiveness program to the tune of $10,000 a year for 5 years, obviously totaling $50,000. One other big change he'd make in this student loan area, if you will, is he'd make student loans dischargeable in bankruptcy. You may not know this, but student loans are a very unique liability. If you have a student loan, but you're forced to declare bankruptcy, even when you're finished that bankruptcy process, you still owe that full student loan. They're not dischargeable. Under Joe Biden's plan, they would be dischargeable, like credit card debt or other revolving debt, but that introduces moral hazard to the student loan industry. The only net result of that is student loans would be more difficult to get and interest rates would have to go up. Somewhat inconsistent with making college more affordable. Beyond that, we also know he announced a big plan to boost the economy here in the United States, focused on rebuilding manufacturing in our country. It's a $700 billion investment, with $400 billion going to a mandate to the federal government that they must buy U.S. manufactured goods. $300 billion would be a research and development investment on manufacturing jobs of the future. It's a very pro-U.S. worker type of program where he'd consider pulling out of the phase 1 China trade deal. He'd renegotiate back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He may even increase steel and aluminum tariffs so that domestically produced metals are more cost competitive. More recently, he announced a 10% tariff and tax credit plan. And let me explain. If you're a U.S. domiciled corporation and you build or manufacture your product outside the United States but ship it back here for sale, 10% tariff across the board. Whereas if you invest in manufacturing here in the United States, you would actually get a 10% tax credit. It's a simple plan, it's catchy and so forth, but we also need to understand what ramifications that has. I think you would agree with me, inside the US tax code, we've done a lot of things to incent corporations to move jobs offshore. But if you tariff 10% on all those imported products, you're somewhat incenting that US domiciled headquarters to move offshore. And that may be a fact that we really don't want to have happen. But I don't know about you, when I read this economic plan, the first thing that hit me was, wow, this sounds really Trumpy. And that's exactly my point. There's actually not a lot of difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump when it comes to their plans of rebuilding manufacturing here in our country. But you know as well as I do, anytime the federal government gets their fingers involved in manipulating these markets, you're welcoming foreign retaliation, and the net result of that is higher U.S. consumer prices. But given some of the challenges we've had within the pandemic of supply issues and the like, maybe we're all willing to pay a little bit more so that we don't have those supply issues moving forward. On the infrastructure front, again, this is another nod to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Joe Biden initially had a $1.3 trillion plan focused on more traditional types of infrastructure like roads and bridges and broadband and things like that. But he upped that plan to $2 trillion with a heavy lean towards green and renewable energy. Keep in mind, Joe Biden has not signed on to the Green New Deal, but as we go through this, you'll see very clearly that he picked and chose his way through that Green New Deal to expand his infrastructure plan. He wants us to be net zero carbon by 2050 and 100% clean energy by 2035. And he would rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. Now, those are some really aggressive goals. If you've done any research in the energy space, you know we don't have those technologies today. But we're an ingenious bunch. I'm sure if we set that as a goal, we could figure that out. Now, all of these programs sound very expensive, and they are, but Joe Biden, to his credit, at least put forward a plan to pay for them. And it starts with a $4 trillion increase in tax revenues to the federal government over 10 years, which represents about a 10% increase in revenues each year. But 100%, almost 100% of this increase is focused on the quote unquote 1%ers. So what does that mean to you and I? Well, first of all, he'd get rid of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act for the affluent. And affluent is a very specific word. It connotes not only income, but also wealth. It increased the highest marginal rate to 39.6%, plus that 3.8%. We can't forget that. And for the highest income earners in our country, he would bring parity between the marginal tax rates and capital gains. So no longer would you receive a discount capital gains rate. If you had a capital gain or a dividend, it would be taxed as if you earned it as a W-2 wage. Now, I know that really scares a lot of people, and let me kind of put your fear at rest. Actually, I don't think that would make it into the final plan. That's actually been proposed before, and even there were even a lot of Democrats who didn't support it. So I tend to think that won't make it into the final plan. If you earn over $400,000 a year as a family, your itemized deductions would be capped at 28%. So even though your last dollars of earnings are being taxed at 39.6%, your itemized deductions would only be worth 28%. And for any income above $400,000, he would reinstitute the payroll taxes. And remember, that's a pretty good sized tax at 12.4%. That's actually the #1 revenue raiser in these individual tax code changes that Joe Biden would put forward. He also recently announced that he would limit our ability to use real estate losses to offset other gains. And we know lots of clients that that's exactly what they do. They use those real estate losses to manage their overall gain exposure, and he would limit our ability to do that. On the estate tax front, he'd lower that very generous, roughly $11.6 million we have today and bring it back down to $3.5 million. But he does not specify a tax rate. He has alluded to taking the estate tax code back to the way it was, so I'm assuming it'd be in that 40 or 45% range. But even more impactful is he'd eliminate stepped up basis at death. Pardon me, but let me explain. If you bought a stock at $10 and it grows to $100 and you pass away, your children inherit that stock with a $100 basis. They never have to pay capital gains on that $90 growth. That's called stepping up your basis at death. Well, Joe Biden would let us do that. Your children would owe capital gains on that $90 growth, but we don't know when. It's not spelled out in this plan whether they'd be due at your passing or whether they'd be due at some point when the children sell the asset. Now, just like that $1 million tax that we talked about earlier, I tend to think this one won't make it into a final bill either. Again, we've talked about this, we've tried this, it became, you were simply unable to actually implement this. That it is so complicated to try to figure that out. After all, if you inherited a piece of land, you'd have to figure out, from your family, you'd have to figure out what grandma and grandpa paid for that piece of land 75 years ago. You can imagine the challenges with that. So I just don't think that would make it into the final plan, but it is in the plan, so we wanted to make sure we talked about it. On the corporate side, he wants to increase the corporate rate from 21% to 28% and institute a minimum 15% book profit tax. Again, let me explain. You've probably heard these big corporations that legitimately leverage the opportunities within the tax code to such a degree that they pay no federal income taxes at all. But yet to the SEC, they're reporting they're making all these earnings. Well, those earnings support their stock price. And Joe Biden says that's value to you corporations, so Uncle Sam deserves a cut at a minimum 15%. Bottom line, any corporation that does manage the tax code in that way would really have to rethink their business model moving forward. Now, I do want to transition from the two candidates more into general election issues. And we know, for example, there are certain days that we're coming up on, November 3rd being the last day that any of us could vote. But beyond that, December 14th is when the Electoral College actually convenes and votes for the next president. And January 3rd is when the new Congress, based on these November elections, is actually sworn in. It's that new Congress on January 6th then that would actually certify the Electoral College votes. And then either way, no matter what happens after the election, January 20th, we are going to have Inauguration Day. But when I think about these general election issues, we anticipated a huge turnout in 2020. And certainly the pandemic is affecting that. And that's why a lot of people are suggesting that mail-in balloting is the holy grail. What we need to remember is that general election voters, so November voters, are nearly as savvy as primary voters. Primary voters are the party's bases. They're the ones knocking on doors. They're the ones that show up to every dog catcher election. And in those states where we've had primaries with a big uptick in mail-in balloting, it's been a train wreck. Pennsylvania is a good example of that. I'm not bashing Pennsylvania, but certainly Pennsylvania is a good example of that. And it's challenged by the fact that every state has different rules around ID requirements, signature requirements, deadlines. As a matter of fact, some states still require you to have a notary notarize your ballot before you can mail it in. Imagine how you try to get that done during a pandemic. But what we really want to focus on are those states that have low participation historically in mail-in balloting. And some of those states are just 3 or 4% historically are mailed in. So what happens when that 3 or 4% goes to 30 or 40%? You can see what we're setting ourselves up for. Again, because every state's handling this a little bit differently, I did want to break down the swing states specifically, the states we think that will have the final say in this election. We know Donald Trump really has railed against the idea that ballots are being mailed to every single registered voter out there. That's not happening in any of these swing states. But we do know that some states are actually mailing applications for mail-in balloting. That's Wisconsin and Michigan. And then the other swing states, Arizona, Florida, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, you actually have to request a mail-in ballot. But we also need to understand that the Postal Service is going to have a little bit of say in this election, because in several states, for example, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, ballots only have to be postmarked on 11/3, but they can be received later. And in Wisconsin's case, it's a week later on 11/9. Now remember, it was Wisconsin in 2016 that was the state that put Donald Trump over the top. So that's why this could be a very protracted process that we get into here at the end of this year. All these things just add confusion and anxiety and concern around this issue of election legitimacy in 2020. What really bothers me is that both candidates are actually fanning those flames. What's clear is that both candidates are laying a thick predicate for legal action after the election. And I know what you're saying. You're saying, hold on a second, Jeff, no one's going to overturn the entire country's vote. And you're absolutely right. The idea of contesting an election is to overturn or invalidate just enough votes, maybe in as few as one state, maybe just 1 or 2 districts within that state. And that could be the difference in 2020. We do anticipate that the Supreme Court will certainly hear several cases through this election process. Hopefully, unlike 2000, they won't have the final say. But nonetheless, we have to be aware the Supreme Court could very well be instrumental in this election. Now, beyond that, though, we also know that the polls, national polls, are of concern, a concern in the sense that they're not historically accurate, and they don't even measure how we elect a president. And I grant you that all the credible national polls have Joe Biden leading, but understand the value of national polls is not to tell you who's going to win the election. The value of the national polls is to influence perception and perpetuate momentum. That's it. And certainly Joe Biden's benefited from that in 2020. The math we really want to understand is the Electoral College, because that's actually how we elect a president. You know the magic number is 270 electoral votes, and no matter how a candidate cobbles together the states, the moment they get 270, they're the next president. Now, if we take a traditional look at the Electoral College, we know certain states are going to go Democrat and certain states are going to go Republican. By our count, that gives Joe Biden a lead of 232 versus Donald Trump's 204. And again, in those toss-up states that we mentioned earlier, we understand that the Electoral College votes are what actually matters. And that's why we've been saying since the midterm election in 2018 that this election starts and almost stops in the state of Florida. It was nice that the media finally caught up to it a month or so ago, but we've been saying it for 18 months. And the reason why is because it's so darn big, 29 electoral votes. If Donald Trump wins in Florida, like he did in 2016, that gives him those 29 votes, and now he's effectively tied with Joe Biden. And if Donald Trump is tied, it'll be a dogfight for the remaining 5 states. If there's one thing we know about Donald Trump is he's pretty darn good in a dogfight. Bottom line, at that point, whoever wins the majority of the remaining 5 toss-up states will be the next president. There is one exception. If Donald Trump wins Florida, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, just those 2 states would put Donald Trump over 270. On the other hand, if Joe Biden wins Florida, he can win any one of the remaining 5 states, and he's over 270. Now, if we start seeing, and a lot of people are now starting to talk about maybe a wave election, I just don't see that happening right now. But if we see a state like Ohio come into play, that's when you can start legitimately talking about a wave type of election. So right now, this election could very well come down to those undecided voters. And normally, historically, we would anticipate about 10 to 12% of voters being undecided at this point. That number, by our count, is already down to 6 or 7%. So I spent some time and said, what do I think those determinative issues for those undecided voters could be? And this is a list I came up with. Well, tax policy certainly could be one of those determinative issues because there's starkly different approaches to taxation moving forward. We know our country has suffered through a lot of social justice issues this year, and sadly, we could see that again flare up in, around, or even after the election. But also this perception that the Democrats have moved to the left. If they're perceived to have moved to the left, then Joe Biden could be seen as a placeholder or just an empty suit setting up 2024 for Kamala Harris. And Democrats have tried to position Kamala Harris as a moderate, but it really doesn't match her voting record in the Senate, and it certainly doesn't match the position she took in the debates earlier this year. I think we'll see a lot of those commercials here around the Pennsylvania area specifically with Kamala Harris and her positions from the debates throughout the rest of October. You also can't rule out a positive surprise around the pandemic or the vaccine, or maybe just some unexpected good economic news. You see, my premise is fairly simple. Right now, these undecided voters their top issue is the pandemic, and understandably so. But if those undecided voters could see a tangible, and I want to stress tangible, light at the end of the tunnel, that may shift their priority towards economic recovery. And if that happens, you need to understand that Donald Trump has it in those swing states, has anywhere from a 3 to a 10% lead over Joe Biden on who's best suited to rebuild the economy. So those are some of the things I love watching and looking for through the remainder of this season before the election this year. I'd love to tell you who's going to be the next president. I don't mind calling it when I feel confident. I just have very little confidence in which party's going to win this year. In 2012, I called that election 14 months in advance. I never gave Mitt Romney a chance. I just don't have that clarity this year. Think of the surprises that have happened just in the last 2 weeks, starting with the passing of RBG. And why do we think that the next 3 weeks won't have equal number of surprises? So we just need to prepare ourselves that we are entering into a time of uncertainty and volatility around this election issue. Now, where we do have certainties in the House of Representatives, we know the Republicans need to take back 19 seats in order to gain a majority, but because of that political gerrymandering, that creative redrawing of the House districts as represented by that graphic in the bottom right, there just aren't that many House seats that are actually considered in play. Sadly, out of the 435 House members that we're going to elect in November of this year, only 22 of them are actually considered in play. So again, do the math. If Democrats win 4, they keep the House. So I think it's a pretty easy call to say that Democrats will keep the House this year. It is a little more interesting over on the Senate side, where we know Democrats need to take back 3 seats if they gain the White House and 4 if they don't. But Democrats need to be prepared. They're likely to lose Alabama. The only reason they held that Alabama seat today is because in the special election in 2017 to replace Jeff Sessions, Republicans chose to run a gentleman by the name of Judge Roy Moore. If that name sounds familiar, you might remember that he was a flawed candidate at best. Republicans chose not to go that direction this time. They nominated Tommy Tuberville, the retired Auburn football coach. Imagine a popular kind of guy around a state like Alabama. So we do believe that the Republicans will take back Alabama, but that changes the map dramatically for the Democrats. Now they need to win in that 4 seats if they gain the White House and 5 if they don't. Every class of senators we elect are a little bit unique. We elect about 1/3 every 2 years, but they're out of cycle with the presidential race. And so just every once in a while, every blue moon, these stars align. 2020 is one of those years. In the class of 2020, there are 35 members, but there aren't that many toss-up states. It's Arizona, Colorado, Maine, and North Carolina. And if you were paying really close attention when we talked about the presidential swing states, you probably noticed that there's almost a significant overlap between those toss-up states, both for the presidential and the Senate races. And that's what instructs us about our call on the Senate. We believe if Donald Trump wins, it means the Republicans will keep the House and Senate. Because if Donald Trump has a good day in those toss-up states, so will those Republican senators. On the other hand, if Joe Biden wins, it means the Democrats are having a good day in those toss-up states, and the odds move in favor of the Democrats taking the Senate. But it's not a 1-for-1. I'm not saying it'll go one way or the other. I'm saying the odds move in favor of the Democrats taking the Senate. It's still a little bit of a challenge for them. And that's actually the #1 question I'm getting from audiences now is, Jeff, as an investor with a probability of a Democratic sweep being around 20%, what does that mean and what should I be thinking could happen in that environment? Well, you'd have to assume that there'd be a negative market reaction. Markets don't like single party control. And that's true of either party. In this case, of course, the Democrats. What we would have to anticipate is that tax reform would get done. Keep in mind, tax reform only requires 51 votes in the Senate, not the 60 vote threshold. So if they have majority, then they could certainly pass tax reform. If there's one thing that Democrats do agree on is they think the progressivity of the US tax code should go up, meaning higher income, higher net worth, and corporate America should shoulder a larger share of a larger tax burden. And they would have votes to make that happen. Now, Joe Biden has suggested that he will not implement the individual tax code changes until after the pandemic. I don't know how he's judging that, and I imagine he doesn't either. But what it does open up is the possibility is we could see a state tax reform and corporate tax reform go into effect January 2021, while the individual tax changes wouldn't go into effect until January 2022. Beyond that, we'd also have to anticipate a big effort towards re-regulating broadly across our economy. And even if Joe Biden wins and he doesn't take the Congress, he still could implement these because, again, this is one of those few areas our president has almost unilateral authority. This broad re-regulation would be across the economy in financial services, healthcare, pharma, big tech, energy, pretty much any industry you can think of would fall under additional security or regulations, pardon me, moving forward. Now, I think we better take a break at that point. We've covered a lot of material, the platforms of the two candidates, as well as general election issues. Let's see what questions you had sent in.
One of the questions we get a lot, Jeff, especially from our executive clients who are still actively working, one of the Biden proposals around the 401k deduction and essentially kind of removing the pre-tax deduction instead of replacing it with a tax credit. Can you just talk about how that would impact high income earners when they switch over to Roth contributions, et cetera?
Well, I think they definitely would switch over to Roth. There's no doubt about that. But keep in mind, those high income earners are already saving anyway, and those limits in 401ks are not tremendously generous, to put it nicely, for saving for your own retirement. So I think that the effect would be negligible. And quite honestly, I think in the long run, they'll actually win. Because if you agree with me that tax rates are historically low now and the taxes are likely to go up, they're in a better position at that point. So perversely, that could do that. Understand the motivation of that positioning, though. The motivation of Joe Biden and the federal government in doing that, I would even argue the creation of Roth IRAs, is because they're greedy. They wanted money now. They needed the revenue. Now, they're cutting their hand off to spite their face, right? Because we know long-term they're going to lose. But you're assuming that a senator or a House member thinks more than 2 or 6 years down the road. They don't. They care about today. And so that's really the genesis of that.
How about the legitimacy of Roth IRAs staying tax-free for life? A lot of our wealthier families will ask, is Congress going to take back their promise of Roth tax-free treatment?
Yeah, I really don't think so. The federal government's generally pretty good. If they make a promise to us and we expose ourselves to taxes and we put that forward under the regulations they set up, they're pretty good about playing by the rules of the game. Now, what I would anticipate at some point, once Congress figures out that this short play is not worth the long play, is we could see a new version come out. So Roth 1.0 versus whatever that new format would be, and they would close out traditional Roth. That's certainly a possibility. But the idea that they're going to just randomly come in and tax Roth, I don't see that happening. Yeah. I think that's a low order probability.
Thank you.
Another question we've been getting is, in a situation where the outcome of the election has not been confirmed by year end, what exactly happens at that point in time, and how does the country move forward?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question because it's kind of an esoteric part of the United States system, and it's a unique system. If it is a tie in the Electoral College, that means no one got 270, it actually goes to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, they then vote for the next president. And I know what you're thinking. You're saying, well, if the Democrats control the House, then Joe Biden's going to win. But that's not how they actually vote. They vote by state delegation. So every state only gets one vote. And in states where you have a split delegation, a tied delegation, they don't get to vote at all. So right now, interestingly, even though it is a Democratic House of Representatives, the Republicans control more delegations. So right now, today, if that happened, Donald Trump would get reelected.
One last question, Jeff. We get a lot of questions on municipal bonds and tax-free bonds.
Can I preface that? Now, that's based on today's Congress, right? We know we're going to elect a new Congress, and it's that new Congress that will make that decision or cast that vote. Nancy Pelosi recognized that about 3 weeks ago, and she has been all over her members to realize the implications of this and really turning out a lot of money and support for those people who are challenging Republicans in specific states that they could actually turn. So, sorry, a little longer answer.
Appreciate it. So tax-free bonds, municipal bonds, if marginal tax rates go up, would they inevitably increase the demand for tax-free bonds?
Yeah, you generally so, because that would increase the net effective yield. But quite honestly, historically, when we look at the data, going from 35 to 39.6, we aren't going to see a big uptick for high-income individuals. I think if we do see the corporate tax code changes, that could be a game changer of munis. I think we could see corporate America buying back into munis at that point because their effective yield would go up sizably if you went from 21 to 28.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Let's flip over now to the planning strategies for 2020.
Sure, absolutely. So I think there are some unique opportunities that we can take into consideration given what we've talked about with the election and so forth. And when I think about those, I want to start with your financial plan. If you haven't updated your financial plan, certainly within the last 6 months, but I would even argue maybe even 4 months, I really encourage you to do that now. We're clearly heading into a time of uncertainty and volatility. You need to make sure your financial plan is tight with that. I know at Brandywine, they talked to you probably incessantly earlier this year about Roth conversions. I think you may have another opportunity to consider Roth conversions later this year. If we see the market volatility around an unclear election outcome, that could be that opportunity. But I also want you to consider talking to your financial advisor about the single most predictable bear market of any investor's life, and that's a long-term care incident. We know 1 out of every 2 of us will need long-term care in our retired years, and it's a big ticket item. Now, if your net worth is such that you can self-insure it and not worry about it, then great, don't worry about it. But if your net worth is such that perhaps you can self-insure it, or maybe you just want to offset some of that risk, we have so many options in the marketplace today that we didn't have 2 years ago, where you can actually allocate some of your assets. You have control of those assets. If you need it for long-term care, there's leverage for your benefit. But more importantly, if you don't need that for long-term care, those monies are still there for the children. Again, just completely different than what we had in mere 2 years ago. So if that's relevant, make sure you make that a topic of conversation. But what I would really have you focus on right now, tactically, is getting the right asset allocation, your stocks, bonds, and cash. And I know Brandywine's constantly managing that for you. But managing that right asset allocation and getting it married to the right asset location. The goal of asset location is to manage tax volatility. And why that's important is tax volatility is likely to go up. We think the revenue line is clear, it will be going up, but it will be a volatile ride along that continuum. So your portfolios have to exist and do well and perform in all those different tax regimes. And your financial advisors are well suited to educate you and take you through that process. But now, in a time of historically low rates, is a time to make some of those maybe a little less fun decisions about exposing yourself to additional taxes. On the charitable front, there are 2 scenarios. One for non-tax itemizers. The CARES Act did create a $300 above the line charitable deduction. I know $300 isn't a lot of money, but they are in around 4 talking about taking that to $4,000 or maybe $8,000 for a couple. If they do, it may make a lot of sense to accelerate some of your 2021 charitable giving into tax year 2020 to take advantage of that bigger deduction. If you are an itemizer, they increase the percentage of AGI we can take as a charitable deduction up from 60% to 100%. So again, same strategy. You may want to accelerate some of that 2021 gifting into tax year 2020. And so let me kind of wrap up with this. Believe it or not, I did a very truncated version of my presentation today, but you're more than welcome to get the entire conversation where we go into topics we didn't have time to talk about today. All you need to do is open up your phone's camera, focus the camera, don't take the picture, just focus the camera on this QR code here on the right side of the screen, and a pop-up will come up on your screen. Tap the pop-up, fill in your email address, and I'll get the full presentation out to you within 48 hours or so. More tactical than that, my colleague and I each spend 4 to 5 hours a day reading and researching, and we'll select 2, 3, 4 articles a day that we think are uniquely interesting for whatever reason. And we post that to our social media. We also have the application you can download. All of that is no charge, thanks to Brandywine, you and your relationship with them. And it really is value add. We don't sell you anything. We don't sell your information. It's just so you can keep abreast of what we're looking at, we think is worthwhile taking your time to read. So with that, I know we have some final questions as well.
question we get a lot, Jeff, we've observed, I should say, is from the CPA industry at large. After the passing of the Secure Act last year, pre-tax IRA assets have become dramatically less attractive to inherit, especially by non-spouse beneficiaries as in kids. We've had a lot of CPAs kind of inquire about perhaps using repositioning IRA assets to buy life insurance that passes tax-free to their kids.
Yeah.
Just comment about that. Do you think that warrants merit?
Yeah, here I have to full disclosure, I'm a huge fan of that strategy. I did it for my own parents.
Okay.
And they had about $600,000 IRA that we've turned into 2.4 million of completely tax-free benefit to their children. And my parents are very fortunate. They have 3 pensions. They save money from the pensions. They don't even spend that. So this money we were able to, since it was going to be our inheritance and dwindled away by RMDs, we just leveraged that into a completely tax-free environment. I think that is a fabulous strategy for the right client. It makes a lot of sense.
Good, thank you.
We're big advocates of creating 3 different buckets of money for tax diversification. As you alluded to before, the tax code is written in pencil, not pen. These 3 buckets being after-tax savings and investments, pre-tax IRA and 401ks, and then your Roth IRAs and HSAs.
Right.
Are you still, now that the pre-tax IRAs have become substantially less attractive from a wealth diversification standpoint, are you still an advocate of this strategy of the 3 buckets?
You know, I am an advocate of the 3-bucket strategy. I think it's imperative that you have that tax diversification. That's exactly what we're talking about with asset location. And for high income individuals, yes, I have been starting to pare back that 3rd bucket of pre-tax. So I may be 2.5 buckets now instead of 3. But yeah, certainly I think, quite honestly, people need to save for their own retirement. They need to do that in a broad cross section of investments. So I'm not ignoring that 3rd bucket, but yes, it's getting sizably less interesting as a bucket I want to overfill. My personal situation, I have a defined benefit plan, so I've been funding that pre-tax money more than I would like, but I use that to manage my tax exposure. So you're always balancing all these issues at various times, and each client's going to be unique. But I perhaps might pull back on that, especially if they're willing to incur the taxes today for the longer term gain over a year. Yeah.
All righty, well, that's a wrap, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe.